Yes, we want our freedom.
Yes, we want our freedom, children. Yes, we want our freedom. We want our freedom and we want it now. Yes, we want our freedom. Yes, we want our freedom, children. Yes, we want our freedom. We want our freedom and we want it now.
Yes, we want our freedom. Just one of the countless songs that played such a key role in the black history of America.
Whether it be the work songs of the Southern slaves that offered hope of a better life ahead,
Or the songs of the civil rights movement.
it's sometimes all too easy to forget about these more difficult chapters in our past.
The people that lived during these times often sacrificed so that we all could live a better life today.
You know, some people think of the struggle for equal rights and freedom as something that happened a long time ago.
And far away.
And yet, right here, where we sit today,
America's heartland.
saw some of the greatest struggles for equal rights.
It was here that people like Colonel Charles Young, a heroic military man that despite incredible odds against him, was able to become a colonel in the U.S. Army, not to mention the nation's first black national park superintendent.
It was here that families decided that separate didn't always mean equal, and they decided to come together and bring their fight all the way to the Supreme Court.
And in Diamond, Missouri, toward the end of the Civil War, when a man named George Washington Carver was born.
George Washington Carver was an incredible American. He overcame insane obstacles and racism to become a scientist and a teacher. He dedicated his life to making this world a better place.
These are the stories of America's heartland, an area that today we are going to refer to a lot. We consider it stretching from Michigan to South Dakota and all the way down into Arkansas.
It's here that the National Park Service has some of our most important protected places that we can all see firsthand.
And today we invite you to join us in celebrating the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service.
Can we get a round of applause for that? The centennial of this amazing organization is why we're all here today. You see, the goal of this 100th anniversary celebration is to connect with and create the next generation of park visitors and supporters and advocates.
That means people like you three up there. You see, you all are going to be the ones in charge of the national parks, so visit them, support them, and learn about them.
There's even a special website called everykidinapark.gov, so if you or somebody that you know is in the 4th grade, you can visit this website and get free passes to national parks.
It's a great opportunity that was created by the White House for people in the 4th grade and their families to see what the National Park Service has to offer.
So don't forget, visit everykidinapark.gov.
Now today, we'll be exploring just some of the over 400 different National Park Service sites that make up this government agency.
And in the process, we'll tell the stories of some of the national park sites and monuments that celebrate the black experience in the Heartland.
Now, these stories go far beyond just black history and are in fact stories of American history.
People just like you and me went on to do incredible things.
Who knows? Maybe you'll hear about a park today that you want to go discover for yourself.
Or maybe, just as the National Park Service encourages, you'll find your park here in the comfort of your own seat in this very theater.
Now, it's important to understand that learning about a history can be hard.
And some of the things we're going to talk about today will be difficult to learn about.
But it's so important that you do learn about it, so that we all as a nation can move forward and never risk repeating it. In fact, if you get one thing out of today's program, we hope it's that you
No matter how old you are, you and you alone.
are capable of changing America for the better.
Now, it's impossible to talk about America's Heartland without also mentioning one of its most prominent features.
The mighty Mississippi.
The Mississippi is a huge part of American history.
We can follow this river along from Louisiana, where a man named Abraham once experienced the horrors of slavery for the first time.
We'll talk about him a little later.
But for now, let's take a look at the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. It's a park dedicated both to recreation and its history embedded in so many aspects of our American culture, and it's in Minnesota.
The Mississippi is a mighty river with an even mightier history.
It begins its 2,350-mile-long journey from northern Minnesota and flows all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, Minnesota is a big farming state, and access to this river gives Minnesota and its farming products a connection to the rest of the world. Now, for the rest of America, the Mississippi means so much more. It represented a chance for slaves to escape the only life that they ever knew. And as time went on, The Mississippi played a key role in becoming part of America's Underground Railroad, helping thousands of slaves make their way north and westward to freedom.
No more weeping, no more weeping, no more weeping over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, the mighty Mississippi, freedom at last. This river separates America's east from America's west, and that is so important because just 151 years ago, if I was to stand on this side of the river in Missouri, then I'd be considered a slave right here in America. But if I was to cross over into that state of Illinois, then I'd be considered free, just like all of y'all are here today. Now, I want y'all to think about what that really means, not having your freedom. You see, back in these days, whether or not you were free depended on two things: the color of your skin and what side of this here river you lived on. Now, my name is Miss Millie Wade, and, well, the reason I know so much about this here river is that not too long ago, I made my journey across it myself. You see, I was born a slave on a big farm, a plantation is what we called them, and life in slavery was one worse than you could imagine. When I got my chance to escape, I took it. It was a long and hard and dangerous journey, and it took me over a year because I was walking the whole way, but I finally made it up to that state of Illinois for freedom. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important that you all understand what slavery was and why it was in America to begin with.
In 1619, African slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, to help build the first English colony in America.
Now, how many of y'all done heard of Jamestown before? Almost all of you, okay.
Good. Now, it's important to understand that these Africans weren't coming to America because they wanted to. They were being forced to come here.
Like I said, slavery was not the kind of life you wanted to lead. You were forced to work from sun up to sundown, and any money that you made went to somebody else, somebody who owned you.
Can you imagine that? What it must have felt like to be owned by another person.
And yet this went on for 250 years in America. Now, eventually some states and people started working towards putting an end to it, but I tell you, just as many people were working to keep it going in this country.
As time went on, more and more Americans turned against slavery. And as America grew from its original colonies and began to move further west, the question of slavery demanded more and more attention.
And tension started heating up on both sides of the issue.
Meanwhile, some 4 million people living in this country found themselves living as slaves.
Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but my Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah.
You see, slavery is one of those dark chapters in American history that can be especially hard to learn about. But even in those times, there were those people and figures that were able to rise above this terrible institution. Some managed to save themselves by escaping to freedom in the North. People like Harriet Tubman. Have any of you heard of her? Good. Can anybody tell me what you know about her? Anyone? Yeah? She did play a key role in the Underground Railroad, but not necessarily. Sorry, what?
Didn't she make a couple trips back and forth from the north to the south?
She did, that's right. And after she escaped originally on the Underground Railroad to the north, she returned to rescue some 300 people on her 19 trips to the south. Now, escaping on the Underground Railroad was dangerous, but there was another option, which brings us to the 1840s in St. Louis, Missouri, where we'll meet a man named Dred Scott. Now, he started a court case that was unlike almost any other the world had ever seen.
Now, I had been born a slave up in Virginia. Up until then, they had called me, a valuable piece of property. You see, back then, I wasn't even considered to be a person, but I tell you, I laughed, I cried, I heard about things. I was just like any of y'all. I mean, tickle us and we'll both laugh, cut us and we'll both bleed red. America was a very different place back then.
In 1846, Dred Scott was 50 years old and had spent his entire life living as a slave.
I moved from farm to farm and from family to family, and I just couldn't take it anymore. Now, my master had taken me up to Illinois and Wisconsin. Those territories didn't allow slavery, and I saw for the first time what that really meant. I saw free black people walking around, and I thought to myself, now, this is something I have to have.
In April of 1846, Dred Scott and his wife sued their master for their freedom.
What choice did we have? I mean, a life in slavery wasn't one we could continue to lead. And, well, we took our master to court and we sued him for our freedom. And, that first time we won, but he tried to take us back into slavery, so we had to take him to court again. And I tell you, this went on and back and forth for 11 years until we ended up in the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C.
In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled.
I will never forget what that man, Roger B. Taney, said. He said, slaves were not considered to be people and therefore had no right to sue. No right to sue.
That decision did little to keep America calm.
I mean, I didn't understand that. How could a nation founded on the belief that all men are created equal take so long to treat its citizens as equals?
With the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court had made one of its most important decisions in the history of the country. And the countdown of the Civil War moved a little closer, with people on both sides working to make slavery a national issue. Now, today in St. Louis, just a few blocks away from that giant silver arch, sits the old courthouse, now a national memorial where the Scots first started their fight for freedom. It was an incredible time in American history, a period of big changes.
In the East, the population was growing, which meant looking to land west of the Mississippi, places like Kansas.
Now, this meant bringing peace between the native people of those lands and the settlers moving westward.
A peace that was rarely kept.
We also want to note that there are many difficult chapters to our nation's past.
And we encourage you to find out about those native people that had entire societies and cultures before they were removed from their lands.
That's right.
The National Park Service has several park sites and monuments dedicated to those native people, from the Cherokee to the Navajo to the Apache and the Lakota Sioux.
Now for us today, we want to honor the black experience in the Heartland. And for now, that includes the issue of 3 or 4 million people living in this country as slaves, and America's increasing feelings that perhaps slavery should end.
And no place played a bigger role in all of this than Fort Scott, Kansas.
Visiting Fort Scott is like peeling away the layers of an onion. From this single site, you can explore so many events and periods that made America what it is today. But let's take a look at the 1850s, at a time when the fort itself had closed and its buildings were being sold to the highest bidder. Now, Kansas in the 1850s was a territory that was struggling with slavery. In fact, the issue was such a painful one that it earned it the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Now, it was during this time that the fort, no longer used as a military post, went on the auction block. Its buildings would play an integral role in the black history of that area. But instead of hearing me gab about it, let's go to the fort.
America has opened the doors of the West to expansion, and the last thing we need is for the tragedy of slavery to infect its borders. That's why we, abolitionists, are opening up the Fort Scott Hotel. Now, you can call it the Free State Hotel. Free State Hotel is open to any man, woman, or child coming to Kansas to make sure that slavery does not. It's not welcome here.
We appreciate your opinion, sir, but if Kansas is to succeed as a farming region, then Kansans have every right to own slaves. It's the American way, and we're not going to let anyone stop us. We're more than happy to purchase the barracks and turn it into a Western hotel, a place for pro-slavery guests to stay.
Directly across from the Free State Hotel?
That's right.
Border ruffians.
I beg your pardon.
You border ruffians are undoing the very fabric of society.
Border ruffians are people from Missouri coming into this territory.
That's right.
I'm a Kansan born and bred.
We will abolish slavery if it's the last thing we do.
Abolish?
That's right. We are abolitionists, which means we will put an end to it. We are abolitionists, and we will abolish slavery.
We need this hotel on the issue of slavery. There are a lot of people that are going to be coming into Kansas to make sure that it's kept legal.
These are human beings you're talking about, sir. Slavery has no place in America.
There will be slavery here, or there will be blood.
My fellow Americans, I urge you to look into your hearts and stand with me against this tragedy of slavery. Clap along with me as I sing. I am an abolitionist, so urge me not to pause. For joyfully do I enlist in freedom's sacred cause. Give yourselves a round of applause. Now, for many years after this, Kansas would erupt into a cycle of violence and protest that would come to be known as the battlefield of Bloody Kansas. This resulted in some 60 Americans on both sides of the issue losing their lives. Now, eventually Kansas would join the Union as a free state, but it would be years before fairness was really seen between races in this area. You know, the Battle of Bloody Kansas is so closely associated with Fort Scott that people sometimes forget the other amazing things that happened there. For instance, Fort Scott is also home to Kansas's first Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry. George Washington Carver himself spent time there both working and going to school, but we'll talk about him a little later. Perhaps we better back up. You see, it's impossible to talk about slavery without also acknowledging some of the people at the heart of the battle and whether or not it would continue in America. Perhaps one of the most famous figures that you all might have heard of is a man named Abraham Lincoln. His house in Springfield, Illinois is a part of the National Park Service.
Welcome to Springfield. I'd love to have you. My house is open. In fact, my Kentucky birthplace, my childhood home, and Ford's Theater are all preserved by the National Park Service for you to come see. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm not much to look at. But I can promise you the beard helps. The truth is, slavery was a difficult issue for me. I didn't like the idea of slavery, but it took me a long time to decide that it needed to be gotten rid of altogether. I remember the first time I realized what a truly awful thing slavery was. You see, I overheard you folks talking earlier about the Mississippi, and I'm going to let you in on something that not a lot of people know about. Once, I hauled goods down to Louisiana on the Mississippi River. I hadn't seen much in the way of slavery until then, and my parents hated the idea of it, which is part of the reason we left Kentucky and moved to Indiana and Illinois. I didn't think slavery was right, but I wouldn't find out how terrible it really was until I was in the South and saw the pain it caused. I remember seeing a young slave girl there who was about to be sold.
Oh, excuse me, sir. I'm
Not
sorry.
at all, pardon me. You seem troubled. Is there something I can do to help?
Where are you from?
I'm from Illinois.
A free state.
That's right.
So I guess you're not going to the auction. That's where I'm headed now.
You don't mean that...
My master's selling me today. I'm headed to the auction block.
Well, I've never seen a slave auction before. An auction is used for selling things in the North. Things like wagons and tools.
Not people.
No, not people.
I wish I had been born up north. I'm so scared right now, I don't know what to do. They're gonna put me up on that auction block, and they're gonna make me walk, and they're gonna let people grab me to see if I make a good work or whatever else. You never know how a new master gonna treat you. They can make your life so bad it ain't worth living. They can do whatever they want, and I can't do nothing.
Well, I wish there was something...
There's my master now. If he sees me talking to you, I'm gonna get in trouble.
Well, I'm sorry.
I gotta go.
I had never liked the idea of slavery. But to see it firsthand, human beings chained, whipped, beaten, and sold, it disgusted me so badly that I told my friend from the boat, if I ever get a chance to do something about the business of slavery, I'm going to hit it hard. Years later, I was at my home in Springfield, Illinois. There I made the decision to enter public service. The issue of slavery would become the keystone of my career.
I lived in Mr. Lincoln's neighborhood a few blocks down. Now, I was lucky enough to be a free black American, but there were several blacks living in Springfield not quite so lucky. I knew of many indentured servants, which meant they weren't paid for their work, and nor were they treated fairly, and, well, I also knew of 6 slaves living in town.
You see, in Springfield, the issue of slavery wasn't as widespread as it was in the South. But I witnessed my neighbors struggling.
I'd always considered Mr. Lincoln to be a friend. I remember his beautiful two-story home on the corner of 8th and Jackson. He and his wife, Mary Lincoln, lived there for 17 years.
Yes, yes. I met and married my wife right here in Springfield. Much to the dismay of her family.
You see, it was well known that Mary Lincoln was well-to-do or rich, and, well, people used to joke that Abraham didn't have the money to buy the sheets for a bed, let alone the bed itself, when he first got here.
Yes, it's true. But before long, I was a successful lawyer.
Then before long, he was a daddy to 4 little ones and a big old dog they called Fido.
I loved my family dearly, and I did everything I could to make them happy. But I wanted to make a difference in my country too, so I decided to run for President of the United States.
I recall some of us from the neighborhood used to join him on his front lawn and help with his campaign.
I remember my campaign song like it was yesterday. Hurrah for the choice of the nation, our chieftain so brave and so true. We'll go for the great Reformation, for Lincoln and liberty too. Lo and behold, I became president.
I remember that day he left our little town. He was bound for the White House.
I remember standing on a train platform with the rain beating down on my shoulders, and I looked out on my friends and neighbors, and I was overcome with emotion.
I will never forget the way he spoke to us that day, that tone we had all come to know. It was a bit trembly, but he always got his point across.
My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feelings of sadness at this parting. To this place and these people I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children were born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I shall return.
Of course, we knew he would never return to our town as our neighbor, but what we wouldn't have guessed was that our country was about to be torn apart by the Civil War. And we never would have guessed that that war would result in the end of slavery. You see, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This freed slaves living in the southern states.
It's what needed to be done. Of course, it was the 13th Amendment that officially ended slavery. You see, we are a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal. Did you hear me there? All men are created equal. And if we believe that, and I do, then at no time were we closer to that reality than when we freed 4 million Americans living as slaves. 4 million.
No more auction block for me. No more. No more. No more auction block for me. Many thousand gone.
With the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War, America had closed one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history. Now, the struggle for civil rights still lay ahead, but for us in this moment, this was a wonderful thing for America. You know, I nearly forgot. With all the talk of the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War, I nearly forgot that toward the end of the Civil War, there were 2 amazing men born who both changed America in their own ways forever. One was George Washington Carver, who you'll learn about a little bit later. And the second is Colonel Charles Young.
Well, I just learned that just 3 years ago, President Obama, using something called the Antiquities Act, changed Wilberforce, Ohio, into the Buffalo Soldiers National Monument. How do you all do? My name is Colonel Charles Young. I was just dusting off my old uniform. I think my children, Charles and Marie, must have run off with my hat. But, oh, it's so good to be back in Wilberforce, Ohio. This town played a pivotal role in the Underground Railroad and is also home to our nation's first black-owned and operated university. I know because I taught there for a spell. I loved Wilberforce, Ohio. It was one of those fantastic gems dotting the Ohio countryside. I liked it so much I purchased property here, and, well, I started to call it my home. Little did I know that it would one day be called the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument. Well, who on earth could that be?
It's me, Colonel Young, the junior ranger that emailed you.
Well, hello, how are you?
How do you do, Colonel?
Quite well. I don't know if I
Sure,
mentioned
sure.
there'd be an audience here.
Oh, my goodness. No, I don't believe you did. Well, I sure am glad I baked this birthday cake. It's for the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. Well, my mom makes it. It's still good, though. Well, how do you do, folks? It's sure is nice to meet all of you. I'm Junior Ranger Christopher. You could be a Junior Ranger, too. All you have to do is visit a national park and sign up. We're at a national park. We're at one right now. You can do it today. You get a cool badge and a certificate, and you can visit the parks and explore the parks and learn about the parks and share what you know about the parks. Well, with everyone.
Well, that's why we're all here today.
That's right. I've been to a ton of parks. See? And my favorite person to learn about in all those parks is standing right here, Colonel Charles Young.
Now, I was just about to share with these people how
You were the third black graduate of West Point?
Well, that's true, but I was
And
going
how
to
you were given full military honors?
Well, yes.
And
but
how you
also-
overcame all kinds of challenges like racism?
That's true as
And
well.
how you overcame these challenges to serve your country?
Yes.
And how in 1923 you were buried in Arlington National Cemetery?
My, jumping the gun, are we?
Sorry, sir.
That's quite all right. I was just about to share with these people another special part of my life. That's right, I was made superintendent, the first black superintendent of a national park of General Grant and Sequoia National Park.
Wow. I love national parks. I love all of them. Each and every one of them. From Michigan's Sleeping Bear Dunes, named the most beautiful place in America, to Nebraska's agate fossil beds. You can see real fossils there. Talk about history.
Well, at which park did you become a junior ranger?
Oh, at your old house, at the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument.
My, I am so glad you went there.
Me too. Hey, how did you become a colonel in the Army?
Well, you see, a long time ago, a big war broke out in Europe called World War I. And well, when this broke out, I was the highest ranking black officer in the military.
Wow, that's amazing.
Oh, well, that's not even the most inspiring part.
Oh?
You see, back in these times, there were a lot of people who didn't like me, and well, they did things to try to keep me from achieving my goals.
How could anyone not like you?
Well, Christopher, have you ever been bullied before?
Yeah. I hated it. It made me feel terrible, and the thing is, I was being bullied for no reason at all.
Well, you see, what happened to me was similar to that, but much worse because it was more people and more often and more accepted. It was like that all the time. I mean, my whole time at West Point, they called me terrible names and purposefully did things to make it harder for me.
That's terrible.
That's why you should never put down anyone or make fun of them for any reason, because you have no idea what their struggles are, what they could have become if they were only given the chance.
So, after you graduated West Point, is that when you became a Buffalo Soldier?
Yes, the Buffalo Soldiers started at the end of the Civil War in 1866 and lasted all the way until 1951. This name was given to all black regiments in the military.
But where on earth did the name Buffalo Soldiers come from?
You know, that's an excellent question, and a history not very many people know. You see, back in these times, the land was occupied by Native Americans, and there were buffalo everywhere. It was originally the Apache who gave us the name because, well, they thought our hair resembled that of the buffalo. You see, they respected the buffalo, and in turn, they respected us. Buffalo were strong and powerful and unyielding, and, well, so were we.
That's so cool!
Have you ever heard of the young writer Paul Laurence Dunbar?
No, sir.
Well, he is one of my favorites. He wrote a song in dedication to all of the black soldiers who fought for this country, and, well, it's called The Colored Soldiers. I could recite a bit of it for you if you'd like.
Okay.
Yes, the blacks enjoy their freedom, and they've won it dearly, too. For the lifeblood of their thousands did the southern fields bedew, and their bondage of their capture and the death of slavery's night, their muskets flashed the dawning, and they fought their way to light.
Wow. The Buffalo Soldiers must have been so brave in the face of so much adversity.
Well, of course we were, so much so that people forget about the things that Buffalo Soldiers did during peacetime. Several Buffalo Soldiers went on to become national park rangers in places like Sierra Nevada, Yosemite, and Sequoia.
So can you tell me more about the war?
Certainly. A famous man at the time who used to be president by the name of Roosevelt thought that I should be promoted to brigadier general.
Wow, that's like a really powerful position in the Army.
Yes, it is.
So did you, I mean, were you?
Unfortunately, no. You see, back in these times, there were people who, well, they didn't want to see someone like me in a leadership position.
Do you mean because of the color of your skin like we talked about earlier?
Exactly. But I wanted to serve so badly that I saddled up my horse and rode 500 miles all the way to Washington, D.C. I did it in 15 days, too. That was very fast for the time. See, I had to prove once again that I was strong and capable.
Well, just think of how much you could have accomplished if it hadn't been for all that inequality you faced. How were you able to stay so brave?
Well, what I always like to say is that the thing to be most desired is confidence in oneself.
You know, Colonel, you've been through so much and continued to succeed. Can I ask you something?
Well, certainly anything.
Would you autograph my National Parks passport book?
Of course, just let me go find a pen.
I tell you, thanks a million, Colonel, for your service. You know, there are all kinds of great stories about Black Americans who fought for what they believed in. As a matter of fact, we talked about the Fort Scott National Historical Site earlier. You learned about that earlier, right?
Yeah.
Well, when I went there, there was a ton of information on how Kansas was the first northern state to recruit, train, and send black soldiers into combat during the Civil War. And most of these soldiers were runaway slaves from places like Arkansas. You know, they were called the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment. My, that's a mouthful. But you know, in their first battle, they were outnumbered. There were twice as many Confederate soldiers as there were of them, but they won, which went to prove that they could fight with the same intelligence and bravery that any other soldier could. You know, I'd have to say that Colonel Young's my favorite person connected to the parks. Do any of you have a favorite person connected to the parks? Or has a memorial about them or something? Anyone? Yeah?
John Muir, of course.
John Muir? What did he do? I haven't heard of him before.
He's the famous environmentalist for the parks out in Sierra Nevada.
I can't wait to learn about him. That's going to be the first thing I do when I get home. I wonder where the Colonel went.
Well, hello, everybody.
George Washington Carver? Hey, George Washington Carver! It's the Peanut Man! It's the Peanut Man! Sure, it's nice to meet you.
Well, nice to meet you too, young man. What's your name?
Oh, I'm Junior Ranger Christopher, sir. At your service.
Well, so nice to meet you, and welcome to my laboratory here at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. This laboratory is where I did all of my work. God's little workshop is what I called it. You see, my life wasn't that easy. I was born a slave in Diamond, Missouri, and well, at a young age, my mother was kidnapped, and I never saw her again. I had a lot of hardships from them, but I didn't let that get me down. I loved science and education. I wanted to teach people that nature knows no waste. I wanted to help lift my fellow man out of poverty. I wanted everybody to understand that we can all live together peacefully. Black, white, it doesn't matter.
Truly. I mean, your work was amazing. And thank you so much.
Oh, well, of course. But as I like to say, it's best not to seek too much appreciation, but to know you're right and go on ahead, whether or not people appreciate it, because eventually they will.
You know, I've heard people refer to you as the Peanut Man. Well, like I did a minute ago. But when they say that, I say to them, George Washington Carver was so much more than that. Like, you're a humanitarian, a teacher, a scientist, an artist, but you changed America. And I just can't believe that you dedicate your life's work to the average person and poor farmers.
Well, of course. I mean, I came from a life of slavery, so I knew how hard it was to farm, and I would never forget where I came from. I worked for the people that I knew.
You know, I have one question for you, though, Dr. Carver. Why wouldn't you patent all your uses and discoveries? You could be a millionaire.
Well, I didn't want my discoveries to benefit certain specific favored persons. You see, if I know it, you can know it for the price of a postage stamp. The good Lord charges me nothing for knowledge, and I will charge you the same.
I guess that makes sense. So, but how did you deal with all the people that were trying to keep you from succeeding?
What I always said, and I tried to remember, is that fear is at the root of all hatred, and, well, hatred within will eventually destroy the hater.
What does that mean?
It means a lot of times when we hate someone or something, it's based out of feelings of being afraid of whatever that is. And, well, those feelings within us are not good for us, and so the other people don't have to worry about them as much.
You know, it's no wonder that you were the first national park dedicated to a black individual. In 1943, with the George Washington Carver National Monument.
That was just 7 months after I died.
You know, one of my favorite quotes that's often credited to you is, "How far you go in life depends on your being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, and tolerant of the weak and the strong, because someday you'll have been all of these."
You know, that is very true. Now, I wish I could stay here and talk to you some more, but I got my plans to tend to.
Oh, okay. Well, it sure was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, young man. Now, stay in school now.
I will. You know, Dr. Carver and Colonel Young were just two amazing men born into a very different America than the one they left behind. But they valued education and hard work. Well, something I think we could all value a little more. But you know, before we go any further, I think we should go back to the time these two men were born. You know, toward the end of the Civil War. Of course you knew that. Everyone knows that. And toward the end of the Civil War, America was moving west with things like, the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act was really cool. It gave every American the right to 160 acres of land in exchange for 5 years of residence and labor on the land.
Now, hold on just a second. Now, the Homestead Act was issued in 1862, but it didn't come into effect until January 1st, 1863. Now, that happens to be the same day the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect. America was changing. Places like Kansas, already seen as a promised land, so many slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad, now opened its arms even wider to welcome these newly freed slaves moving up north to find a better life for themselves. They called us exodusters because we was making our exodus from the South. And I tell you, it wasn't just a few of us neither. We joined over 1 million slaves making that long journey up across the Mississippi to find a better lives. Towns would spring up overnight, and people were coming in from places like Kentucky and other states to try to push the slaves in certain directions. You know, that reminds me of that time I met that white man named W.R. Hill.
Looky. Step right up. W.R. Hill is the name, and I'm inviting all black citizens of the country to move to the largest black settlement in America, Nicodemus, Kansas.
Nicodemus?
Oh, that's right. Nicodemus, Kansas. Beautifully located on the Solomon River, 240 miles northwest of Topeka. No saloons will be allowed in the town. Come join us in this beautiful, gorgeous mass of geological pulchritude renamed to call the Promised Land. Great soil and great climate.
Now, who are you?
My name is W.R. Hill, and I'm inviting all black citizens to move to the largest black settlement in the country. And I'm a great developer of that land. Come on.
Well, at the time, that sounded good to me, so me and my husband, we saddled up our wagon and, well, we started heading out to Kansas. It was a long journey, and I became very sick along the way. You see, we didn't have very much money or very much food. Now, I had heard that they were offering free rides up to Kansas and Nebraska and Minnesota, but I tell you, that wasn't true. In fact, a lot of what I heard about moving out west wasn't true, especially about how nice Nicodemus was. I remember when we pulled up, some of the men from the wagon were yelling, there's Nicodemus. Now, being sick, I hailed this news with gladness. I stood and I looked with all the eyes in my head. I said, where is Nicodemus? My husband pointed to some smokes coming up out of the ground, and he said, that's Nicodemus. The families were living in dugouts. The scenery was not at all inviting. I saw this and I became very sad.
You see, with no trees to really speak of, people had taken to living in these underground huts. Still, there was something about this place. Something sacred. Sacred because men had spilled their blood there to keep slavery out.
It was the promised land. It wasn't much, but we worked hard to have our own life there. Our first taste of freedom, and well, it was the promised land to us.
The Homestead Act did a lot for Americans. It gave not just black Americans, but every American, immigrants, the chance at what I guess you would now call the American dream.
The Homestead Act is honored in Beatrice, Nebraska at the Homestead National Monument.
They're honoring the millions of Americans that moved west in search of their piece of the American dream. Now, a little further west is the National Park site for Nicodemus, Kansas. They are honoring the thousands of black Americans that moved west in search of a better life for themselves with the help of the Homestead Act. Now, one of these homesteaders was George Washington Carver. He homesteaded in Kansas before moving to the Tuskegee Institute. Let's take a look at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Now, there we'll meet a man named Bass Reeves. Now, he worked for the federal court in the Western District of Arkansas.
6'2", expert on the pistol and the rifle. Superhuman strength. Those are just some of the words used to describe me. How do you do? Name's Bass Reeves, and well, I was one of the most famous deputies in the Wild West. You see, back before Oklahoma was even a territory, it was a haven for criminals, and they needed people like me to come in and clean up the area. Now, I was born a slave in the great state of Texas, and well, I went to go live with the native tribes of the area. I learned their languages and their ways, so when it came time to make peace with these people, guess who they called? Now, being born a slave, I didn't learn how to read, so I had to memorize my warrants and make my arrests that way. Still, with that obstacle, I made over 3,000 arrests and never got the wrong criminal. I used to make up a good disguise and learn all I could about the criminals and then capture them when I knew all I had to. It was a hard life, but I tell you, Fort Smith, Arkansas, now it's a national monument, but if it weren't for people like me, I don't know if the Wild West would have ever been tamed. Anyway, I want to thank y'all for letting me come out here and tell my story, and if I may, perhaps you'll consider making Fort Smith your park.
Oh, which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? Oh, we shall overcome, boy, we shall overcome. My daddy was a freedom fighter, and I'm my daddy's son. And I'm gonna fight for freedom till everybody's won. Oh, which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on?
We shall overcome, boy, we shall overcome. My daddy was a freedom fighter,
And I'm my daddy's son.
and I'm gonna fight for freedom till everybody's won. The Civil Rights Movement was a period in America's history that lasted from 1954 until 1968. Now, this part of history is one of those that's really hard to talk about because it wasn't that long ago. But it's from this part of history that some of our greatest heroes emerge.
Folks like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others. Now, it's important to understand that America in 1954 was a very different America than it is today.
You see, segregation was a time in our history where Americans were kept separate from each other based off of the color of their skin.
Now, I want you all to do something. How about everyone close their eyes? Now, imagine that the color of your skin determined things like what restaurant you could eat in, where you could sit in a theater like this one, where you could go to school, and even where you and your family could shop. Okay, you can open your eyes.
This wasn't imaginary. This was the way things really were in America.
Segregation was a way of life.
And it was a big part of American history. Several Americans lost their lives trying to end segregation in places like department stores, restaurants, city buses, and even public schools.
That's right. And one of the biggest fights came over schools and public education. Now, about 30 years after the Civil War, this would be 1896, America decided that things could be separate and equal. Now, this meant exactly what we just talked about. Restaurants and theaters had separate entrances. Students went to separate schools based on their color, and you could only shop in certain stores based on your color. Now, luckily for us, this ended about 60 years ago in the 1950s. Now, in Topeka, Kansas, there was a group of parents and students that got together and started a court case to put a stop to it once and for all. Now, one of these students was named Linda Brown Thompson, and she remembers trying to enroll in a white school like this.
Well, like I say, I grew up in an integrated neighborhood, and I had playmates of all different nationalities. I was so thrilled when I found out I might be able to go to school with them. I remember that day that my daddy took me to Sumner School. Those steps were so big to a little girl. We went inside, and well, my daddy talked to somebody, and then he went into the inner office, and I was made to sit in the hallway with the secretary. And while I sat out there, I could hear voices coming from the inner office, and my daddy's voice was raised. The conversation went on.
Now, look, Mr. Oliver Brown.
Mr. Brown is my dad.
We don't feel the need here in Topeka schools to cater to your people. Now, look, let's be clear about this. Separate is equal. Now, Linda is free to go on to her school just a mile down the way. But we can't accept her here. That's just the way things are. You accept them, and you move on. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have white students, that need my attention.
After that, my daddy came out of the office, grabbed my hand, and we immediately left the school. I didn't understand what was going on. I thought I was going to go to school with all my playmates, Mona and Guinevere and Wanda. Little did I know what was happening next.
What would happen next is the Brown family would forever change America.
I was a welder for train parts and the assistant pastor at St. Mark's AME Church. I was just like any of y'all. I lived my life. I didn't expect to change history. I just knew things weren't right the way that they were. Now, there were 13 of us in Topeka alone and several others across the nation that knew we wanted to change things. So what you saw there, me trying to enroll my daughter in that school, well, that was all a part of the plan. You see, we would take our children to these segregated schools and try to enroll them, and then when they told us no, like we knew they would, we would come together with all these families and try to change things for the better.
I don't normally comment on cases we decide in the Supreme Court, but I can tell you this was quite a case. Segregation in American schools, the separation of students based on color, was not good for America. We had cases from Kansas, South Carolina, Delaware, Washington, D.C., and Virginia. We combined all of them. We took the case from the Midwest so that it wouldn't just be a Southern thing, and a good man like Mr. Brown. And that's how the case became known as Oliver L. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas.
Or Brown versus Board of Education for short.
Mr. Brown here, he changed America.
Oh, no, I didn't. Now, many people were fighting to integrate schools dating back to the 1940s. Now, when I took Linda into that principal's office, it was 1950. It took more time than we thought it would. It took us 4 years until May 17, 1954.
That was Perry Como's hit Wanted. Well, folks, it's May of 1954, and what I'm about to We have news from the Supreme Court. Segregation in American schools is now illegal. Schools in America will now be integrated.
I didn't know what to think. I didn't know how to feel. I mean, it didn't seem like that long ago that we were sitting in that white secretary's office. I had no idea we could change history. You know what it's like to finally be accepted for who you are? That's what that moment felt like in my heart. Like maybe I wasn't quite so different, not quite so unwanted. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. Hallelujah. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table. I'm gonna sit at the welcome table one of these days. One of these days.
Not everyone was so happy to hear about the integration of American schools. School integration caused a lot of anger in a lot of people. And in no place was this more true than Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, the Board of Education there, along with the Supreme Court verdict, announced that schools would be integrated. But it took them more than 2 years to follow through on this. Which brings us to Little Rock Central High School in 1957.
There were 9 of us in all our first day at Little Rock Central High. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Elizabeth Eckford, and I'm to be one of the first black students at Little Rock Central High School.
As governor of Arkansas, I don't want to see our schools be integrated. So I called up the National Guard, and we were to block these 9 black students from entering. And there was a crowd there, I tell you.
I remember getting ready that morning. My sister and I had sewn my skirt together. Our family didn't have a phone at the time, so I didn't receive the call from the other 8 that we were going to enter the school together, so I had to go by myself. That morning, I rounded the sidewalk, and well, when I got near the entrance to the school, that's when things got really bad. There was a crowd of people yelling and saying I didn't belong there.
And she didn't. Segregation had worked just fine. And when I saw those students, my blood began to boil. There will never be integration here. So help us.
I didn't know what to do. I was only 15 years old. I would later recall the day like this. They moved in closer and closer. Somebody started yelling, and I searched the crowd for a friendly face, maybe somebody who could help. I looked into the face of an older woman that seemed friendly, but well, when I looked at her again, she spat on me.
By order of the National Guard and by the state of Arkansas, this school is closed to you. Now go on. Get out of here.
I didn't know what to do. I turned, and there was a crowd of over 400 people screaming that they wanted to kill me. I made my way through that crowd, and it was the longest walk of my entire life. When I got to the bus stop, I could feel a pain that I had never recognized. I was so upset, and I didn't understand why people were acting like this. I almost broke down, and well, that's when that reporter came.
Elizabeth, I have a 15-year-old myself. These people, you cannot let them get you down. Do you understand? What you're doing here is a very brave thing.
I pulled myself together, and finally a friendly white woman came and wrapped her arm around me and helped me onto the city bus. The National Guard blocked our way into the school for weeks, and when they left, we were met with a crowd of over 1,000 people who didn't want to let us in. Finally, we had to involve the president, Mr. Dwight Eisenhower, and he sent federal troops to escort us not only to school, but to each of our classes so we could be safe. Do y'all understand what I'm saying here? It's because of people like me and Linda Brown Thompson that we can all be in the same room here together today. It's these little things we take for granted that people fought and died for so that we could have not that long ago.
Over the next few years, states were slow to integrate schools. And Mississippi, in fact, even added an amendment to its state constitution that banned public schools altogether so that they wouldn't have to integrate them. Now, on the federal level, laws were continuing to be passed that promoted integration in all kinds of areas of everyday life.
It would take years of marches and protests and strong Americans like Dr. Martin Luther King before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. This ensured that all Americans had access to equal rights.
Ensuring that once and for all,
just as the Civil War had 100 years prior.
that the arc of liberty could bend a little more towards justice.
And so it is that the Midwestern United States played a key role in the history of America.
Now today we explored just some of the over 400 national park sites. They give all of us a place to experience,
to reflect,
to understand our past.
You see, it's through fully understanding our past that we can ensure that our future is as bright as ever for all Americans.
The National Park Service is so much more than the massive national treasures that we've all dreamt of going to, like Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon.
It's the small towns of Nicodemus, Kansas, where a new generation of Americans work together to build a better life for themselves.
It's a courthouse in St. Louis, where Dred Scott first started his fight for freedom for himself and his wife.
It's over 400 places just like this dotted across America, some in our towns and some on our bucket lists.
Now, we hope that you reflect on all the stories we shared today.
And take time to discover some of those stories we didn't have time to touch on.
And we hope that you remember what it is about America that makes our stories so powerful.
And that you feel how important it is to not take what you have for granted.
And that there are men and women just like you and me that work every day to make sure that our past remains a part of our present, like that ranger up there.
By working for the National Park Service.
For over 100 years now, this government agency has worked to preserve our natural,
Cultural.
and historical treasures for future generations.
So remember, get out there and visit your national parks.
Thank a ranger.
And remember, visit everykidinapark.gov to see how you can get free passes.
Now, we'd like to share a song with you that's very near and dear to our hearts.
It was originally a poem by a man named James Weldon Johnson and was first sang by 500 first graders in 1900 as a tribute to Booker T. Washington.
It went on to become one of the most cherished songs of the civil rights movement and is sometimes referred to today as the Black National Anthem.
This song has so much history, and we invite all of you to share in that history with us today.
So feel free to join in with us if you know the song. Lift every voice and sing.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicings rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Thank you.
Thank you.